This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and I'm pleased tonight to have with me as a guest Dr. Harold Katner, who is a professor at the Mercer University School of Medicine and an international expert on many things, Harold. But maybe we can talk about some of your efforts to treat infectious diseases in this part of the country, particularly AIDS, and you're sort of an international expert on that subject. But before we do that, Harold, maybe we could ask you a few questions about your journey through life that brought you to this part of the world. And I think you grew up in New Orleans, is that right? Was that your home?
Raised in New Orleans. And, I'm the oldest of 10 children.
You're the oldest of 10 children?
10 kids.
Wow, that's quite a story, isn't it?
It was, it is.
It is. And you went to school?
Yeah, I went to University of New Orleans for college.
Yes.
And then I went to LSU Medical School. And then did my training in Lafayette, Louisiana, in Oshner Clinic, and then
Yes.
I came here right after that.
And you've been in this area for how many years, Harold?
I came here in 1985.
Wow.
So it's been about 25 years, really.
Now, Harold, we were having a little discussion about some of your interests in anthropology. Is that correct? You've been with tribes of headhunters, is that right? And
Yeah.
is that a story there?
Sure, in the Philippines, they still have these headhunting groups in the mountains, and I visited those tribes, almost 20 years ago now. And then there's some groups in the Philippines that are somewhat related to the Australian Aborigines. And I
Yes.
visited some of those. They still hunt with bows and arrows, and quite interesting groups. My major fascination, though, was in Guatemala. I spent some time with a group called the Hacolteca Indians. And it's really sort of what got me going into medicine. I wanted to go into medical anthropology, and I really wanted a tool so I could give something back to the community that I've been
Yes.
working with. And so infectious disease was sort of be a perfect job for that.
Yes, yes.
And I pursued that. But the strange thing that happened was HIV came along.
Yes.
And a lot of the training I had in my undergraduate training was dealing with cultures, social issues, these sorts of things. So it was perfect training for HIV because obviously it wasn't just a disease, it was a social cultural phenomena of a sort. And so my training really assisted me in dealing with this.
Now, HIV has been quite a story in general, it's the way the world confronted this very vicious disease and that struck seemingly out of the blue. And threatened to, I guess, unhinge the world in a way. I mean, if it had kept going, but seems to be pretty much under control, or at least is that too much of a statement to make, Harold? Is it under control now?
I think in this country, the numbers have plateaued. The new cases still are being reported. Right now in our area, we got about one new case every 3 days.
Yes.
That number has been about the same for the last 4 or 5 years. I don't have the exact numbers right in front of me, but from what we have, our statistics in our area, that's been what it is. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, it continues to grow. Areas of Asia continues to grow. The numbers continue to grow. People are more aware of it, and some countries have made major efforts and have dropped the numbers. I think Uganda's done some incredible work as far as prevention and reducing new numbers. So yes, there are areas we're seeing hope. But there's still the issue of continued spread. Even if it's plateaued, those numbers are still a lot. It's a very costly disease, so we really need to be more effective in dropping those numbers.
Now, Harold, maybe you can just tell the story about the appearance of AIDS in the Western world. This took place, I think, started in 1980, but I know the story is a complicated one with lots of scientific debate about how this disease entered the general population.
Well, when they first discovered this, it was because there was a cluster of cases of the strange pneumonia called pneumocystis pneumonia, and a group of men who were having sex with men out in San Francisco and other parts of California. And also there was a cluster of similar infections in New York City. In fact, one of the people at the CDC that recognized this was I think she was a woman who was giving out the medications for this unusual pneumonia, and made this known to some of the people, the epidemiologists, and they looked into this and said, boy, this is very strange. So I believe it was in June of 1981, if I'm not mistaken, that the MMWR published the first set of cases. And it was December of that year that New England Journal had a big, I think it was 3 or 4 articles on it. So that was the first time it was recognized. But when we looked at this infection, it looked like these people had taken a long time to get sick. We didn't know it was a virus yet, but it was feared that this had been around for some time. In retrospect, those people that were dying probably had it for 10 years. Now, the debate comes in, where did it come from? And everybody started looking at first to Haiti because there was an AIDS epidemic in Haiti. But all the Haitians that came prior to 1977 that they could find, and they finally could do serologic studies on them, blood tests on them, had no HIV. Then they looked to Africa, and then they found this HTLV1 virus there, and they finally discovered the what you call first HTLV3, which was subsequently named HIV. And they thought, well, it came out of Africa. And the epidemic was raging in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And so all the research pointed as that's the source. Now, with my background in anthropology, as I was listening to all these people looking for the source of it, it reminded me of what happened when syphilis was first popping up in various countries. Like in England, they called syphilis a French disease. In France, they called it an English disease.
Yes.
And then everybody blamed it on the Italians. So it was...
On the Italians.
Yeah, so it was, I mean, so you saw this thing, and it's something called ethnocentrism. You always blame something bad on somebody else.
Yes.
So I said, well, was this really something new or had been here a long time? And what I did in my own research years ago is I took the definition of AIDS, which now we know is very good because before we had a blood test,
yes,
all those patients we picked up were proven to have AIDS, HIV. I took that definition, I went back in time, and I looked for cases similar to these cases, and I found about 30 cases going all the way back to the 1800s. Another group of physicians out of Israel did the same thing. They looked for a different set of diseases that also define AIDS, and they found another 15 or so cases. In one of their cases that they picked up, somebody had saved the tissues from 1968, and that patient, tissues were taken out of the freezer, tested, and that patient had died of AIDS. So I really don't think it's a new disease. I think it's an old disease, but a new epidemic. How could this thing pop up? Well, if you go back 10 years in our society, what happened in the early 1970s, late 1960s, we had the sexual revolution. And you can see epidemics of syphilis and herpes and gonorrhea and genital warts and all of these things just skyrocketing in the early 70s. And if you think about it, that's when HIV spread in our society because it took 10 years for those people to get sick. So that curve of AIDS that started in 1980, 1981, you back that up 10 years, it fits right on top of those other curves. So I really think it's here. I think the reason we're seeing such a horrible epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa and even our own African-American population is because we're seeing a disease that is in a population that's never seen this disease before, like measles in Hawaii. It killed almost all the Hawaiians because they had no resistance, no way to handle this. HIV is acting the same way in that population. So it's just simple epidemiology. And eventually, with time, we're going to select out a more resistant population like they did in Europe. Now we know in Europe that anywhere between 1 to 10% of the Europeans have genes that if you have 2 copies of those genes, you can't even get the virus because you have resistance to it. There's been debate, well, how do those genes get there? Somebody said, well, if it's not they don't want to believe it's HIV. They say it was a plague did it or the smallpox did it. But I don't think those theories have really held up. And I really think it's been around a long time. Of course, what I'm saying is very controversial. And
so there's another school of thought that would maybe maintain that AIDS jumped the species barrier in West Africa, and that it's, as other diseases have done. So many of the diseases that afflict humans might have had an animal reservoir, sure. and that's a very common story about different kinds of plagues. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if you look at chimpanzees, for instance, chimpanzees have a virus called SIV. It's very closely related to ours. It may have jumped Now, the question is, where did it go? Did it go from them to us or us to them? They've been blaming the monkey hunters on these transmission.
Right.
Now, Jane Goodall in 1976, her book called In the Shadow of Man, documented that they had found chimpanzees literally stealing human babies and eating them. Now, chimpanzees don't cook and chimpanzees don't use condoms. So if you have the virus in a human population, and if chimpanzees are stealing these human babies and eating these human babies, could the virus have gone the other way? Because there's also viruses in sheep, goats, cows, and horses that are retroviruses. We've known about these for a long time. Now, those viruses were not domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa. They were domesticated, those species of animals were not domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa. They were domesticated in Asia, the Middle East, and in Europe. So we've had contact, and those viruses broke off about 10,000 years ago. Just about the same time we domesticated those animals. If you look at the zooarchaeological evidence for this. So the contact with those animals was very well documented, which I won't go into a lot of details, but you know, we probably gave the infection to those animals, or if you look at it. The equine infectious anemia virus may be transmitted by horse flies, so theoretically could have gotten from the horses. But those retroviruses, being cousins of ours, though again they broke off a long time ago, did we have this virus for a long, long, long time in our population at low levels, but over time transmitted it to those animals, or if you want to say back to us, and then we brought it to Africa. There's a virus in a certain group of species of monkeys that in West Africa that that virus broke off about 400 years ago from our virus. And who got to Africa 400 years ago was the Portuguese. So again, did we bring it in there? Did somehow those animals got infected? I mean, a lot of times you have to bury your bodies deep in Africa so that they'll scavenge the dead bodies. So I'm not saying I'm right, but I think we have other issues we have to look at. And the basic tenets of epidemiology that I was taught about epidemics doesn't quite fit. You know, why do you have a population that it originated in who are suffering from it the most is counterintuitive if you look at pure epidemiology.
Well, it's a rather complicated story, isn't it? I mean, in general, I mean, just to make sort of a comment about it, we do exist in a microbial sea, don't we? So it's we're a little egotistical to imagine that different kinds of virus structures, viral structures, and bacteria are trying to attack us, and they're constantly trying to overcome our defenses. And if we're not exposed to those particular organisms, then we're going to be susceptible, and that's a problem that medicine has to constantly deal with. And in a way, this is a rather good success story, isn't it? If one can say that. Harold, what about the success story, about how this is extraordinary? If one can remember 30 years ago, this new plague is going to just undo the world. And then medical science came to grips with it and has made substantial progress. It's a rather good story in many ways. Could you relate that story, Harold, as to how that happened?
Yeah, and living through it was most interesting, most fascinating. Obviously, initially, we had something we couldn't control. It was a perfect parasite. This thing would infect you. It would allow you to live 10 years. During those 10 years, you could reproduce. 1/4 of your progeny would be infected. During that period of years, you can infect as many people as you could have sex with or share needles with. And so it was the perfect parasite if you looked at it, because it would allow you to have enough progeny to infect in the future, at the same time take a long time to kill you, but allow you to spread to other people. So it was a frightening virus, when we realized what we were dealing with. We also realized it was a mutation machine. This thing would change so much that our antibodies, just wore our immune system down. So we'd never seen anything like this in ever. We never even dreamed of such a thing. So the biggest thing was, how do we stop this? And at first, all of us just felt completely helpless. It was, all of us that were working with it were scared. We were going to pick this up again before we even knew it was a virus. Finally, when we discovered what it was.
It was rather heroic just to see a patient with AIDS. Is that in the start of the disease? Is that correct? People took a certain courage just because the transmission vectors, or just the knowledge of how one caught it was not established.
Yeah, and I was very lucky, because one of the first things one of the older teachers in my medical school did, he said that back in the 30s, the 20s, when they would start medical school, they'd make each student count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they said every 5 of you, out of 5 of you, 3 of you will get tuberculosis before you finish medical school. And 1 out of those 3 will die before they finish medical school.
Wow.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if the statistics were that correct, but it was very frightening. And he said, you don't have to face that now. I remember him saying that. But, you know, if you did, you would be entering this field not because of the money and the glory, everything else that goes with it, but because you were committed to taking care of human beings, whether that would put your life at risk or not. And I'll never forget that. And so when this thing came along, I tried to keep that in my mind every time I dealt with this, because again, yeah, we were afraid. I'm not going to say I was heroic. I was scared. I mean, I didn't want to give this to my family. I didn't want to die from this. I mean, the death was a horrible death. And the images of what these people suffered through are embedded in my brain. So, but in 1985, we finally discovered what it was. By that time, we sort of knew that it wasn't going to hurt us by casual contact. We were pretty certain about that. We knew needle sticks could do it. But by 87, they discovered a medication that seemed to have some impact on it. Long-term studies, though, said it didn't work. They kept working, though, in those areas. And by 1996, they came up with drugs that literally would put the virus down. If you used them in combination, 3 at a time, we could knock the virus out of the bloodstream, stick the thing into the cells, your immune system would improve, and theoretically live a normal life. I never dreamed I would see what I saw. I mean, I had a patient, this was 1996, he was in the in the ICU in one of the hospitals. He was dead, for all I knew. He was on a ventilator. These new drugs came out. I put him on these drugs. I got him off the ventilator. He gained, 40, 50 pounds. He went back to work. He's alive and well. He's teaching somewhere right now, and he's doing fine. But to see him go from that to becoming normal again was dramatic. So these new drugs, now we have quite a few different classes of these drugs, literally can take someone who's got less than 6 months to live and give them a new life.
That's been a very dramatic story. And the story is, maybe there's a cloud over the story in that the drugs are quite expensive, are they not? I mean, what happens to someone that needs the drugs, and how expensive are they, and what's happening with that?
The drugs can cost anywhere between $15,000 to some of the higher cost regimens are $37,000 a year. Now, some of these drugs are now getting off patent and becoming a little bit cheaper, so we may be able to see regimens come down to $10,000 a year, maybe a little bit less. But obviously that's still very expensive, and if you have to come out of pocket with that money, it's going to be almost impossible, with most people's salary. So most insurance companies will pay for the drugs if you have private insurance. What they're doing now, though, is they're making people pay a percentage of the drug. They used to give them co-pays, like $5 or $10 or $20. But now, since some of these insurance companies are realizing how much cost of these drugs are, they're changing their policies to, you pay 20%, we'll pay the other 80%. Well, you got $20,000 bill for, 20% of that's a lot of money. So a lot of the patients are being hurt by their private insurance, and some of them are even dropping private insurance. Some are even quitting their jobs because it's costing them more to live like that with insurance, with a job. Whether if they lose their insurance, lose their job, have no income, then they can get on some of these federally sponsored programs like AIDS Drug Assistance Program. So you have no money, no insurance, then you can get on AIDS Drug Assistance Program, and they will literally pay for your drugs, to keep you alive. Problem is, we've run out of money. So right now we have a waiting list for these patients. Now, the drug companies have come up and have helped us a great deal. They have something called patient assistance programs. So those people that lose AIDS drug assistance program or lost it because there's no more funding for it, or there's lack of funding, the drug companies are now providing free drugs for our patients. So that's been a real blessing. And they've really helped a great deal. The biggest problem, though, is filling out these forms. And though they've made it quite easy, it still takes time to apply for these drugs. And when you're taking care of a lot of people and you've got limited staff, et cetera, it is somewhat of a burden. Medicaid will pay for the drugs, but you have to get prior approval for certain drugs. And talk about a headache at times. I mean, sometimes you'll have a pregnant woman, you've got to go from 2 pills twice a day to 3 pills twice a day, and they want prior approval to that. But if you don't change that medication right away, I mean, there's always a risk of the baby getting infected. I think that problem's been solved. We've had some meetings with Medicaid about this. But this prior approval thing is really a problem because sometimes you need to use certain drugs that are very expensive. Medicaid doesn't want you to do that, yet you know that drug will be the best for your patient. It's still hard to get that medication.
So that's one of the issues that's out there really in the American healthcare system is the idea of the physician being an advocate for his patient. Yeah. And then the government, I guess, attempting to, for many reasons, regulate the system to diminish expenses, and they're with the best of intentions. Sure. But it often is a very frustrating thing for a clinician. Now, Harold, it's been said that one of the problems with a disease like AIDS is it mutates so rapidly, and that patients, for a variety of reasons, might not take their drugs. It's a laborious process, and I think it's fair to say that many people that have the disease have a substantial number, a host of other afflictions that make them not so compliant with their medication requirements. And so if they don't take the drugs, then the disease might mutate, makes things worse for everyone. Any comments about that that issue? Yeah,
I mean, we are seeing individuals that have either acquired infection from people that have not taken the medications properly. I had one gentleman who had resistance to, he was naive. He presented with never been on treatment before. And the person that infected him had been on all of these drugs except for 3. And now we're talking about 20 medications roughly. Well, that patient had resistance to everything but 3 of these drugs. He's alive now, he's doing fine, but his first regimen was one of the most expensive regimens I ever put together. And it took a long time to get him on the treatment because his insurance company was balking at the cost of this. Eventually lost his job, and it might have been because the insurance company refused to, I mean, can't prove this, but sometimes they just refuse to insure certain people in their jobs because of these issues. So, yes, you are seeing resistance. We're seeing resistance in people that have some of the most common drugs we're using, we see resistance. But now we have to test everyone up front to see if they've picked up a resistant virus from someone who's been on medications. And that puts another cost burden because these tests are expensive. But if we don't do that, we're going to create more resistance by giving them a partially active regimen. So it is an issue. So you really have to work with your patients in what they call secondary prevention. You have to make sure they're educated about how they don't need to pass this on to somebody else. So a lot of the work that we do is we educate about condoms, we educate about prevention issues. Even though patients who are having sex with other patients have to understand they could pick up someone else's virus, which can make things just as worse for them. So it's not just an issue of infecting new people, it's infecting they can infect each other with bad virus. So it gets very, very complicated. But that's why we really got to keep working on prevention. People can't say, well, gee whiz, I'll get HIV now and go take my pill every day. I mean, the cost is enormous, but also, this resistance issue, as you point out, is developing. So, and there are sometimes I reach a point where I cannot treat with these people with anything because they've run out of options. So it still can be a lethal disease. I mean, if people imagine there's a pill that will protect them totally from the disease, that's not the case. It's still, there can be situations where there's difficult to overcome. Oh God, yes. Right now, the most tragic thing is these people will take the medicines the patients will take the medicines for a while. And again, they've got a lot of comorbidities like depression and the stigma of this. And a lot of them have picked it up because of underlying comorbidities. The amount of bipolar patients I have is enormous. Patients with schizophrenia, patients who are addicted to drugs. And so all of these behaviors make it very difficult sometimes to get the patients to be perfectly adherent to their medication regimen. So sometimes if they get depressed, they stop the medications, they get very, very sick. And the tragedy is they may end up in the hospital, but they may have something that's not fixable. They may have a stroke or some complication of the disease that puts them in a nursing home. Well, at that point, they are taking the medicines every day, but they're going to live there for the rest of their lives because they can no longer function in society because they're handicapped in such a way that they can't take care of themselves anymore. So it's a very now again, this is a minority of the patients.
Yes.
The vast majority are doing well, but it makes it. I mean, a lot of time you spend a lot of time dealing with those issues because they're so difficult and they're so. I mean, they're hard from a physician standpoint, but they're hard on the patient when the patient gets really, really ill. And to be able to deal with this and deal with them in a compassionate and supportive way is critical, because you don't want to drive them out of the healthcare system. And in times, physicians and healthcare workers, they may get impatient with them. And I've had people not come anymore because they don't, you know, they're scared, or they don't understand,
Yes.
or people have, you know, just not, I guess, been the nicest they could have been to them.
Now, Harold, we have just a little bit of time left, but one of the things that's going on now, this is a worldwide affliction, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there are just tremendous numbers of people that have the disease, that maybe they're not taking their medication, maybe they don't have access to the appropriate treatment. I mean, is there some kind of mutation that's going to arise in those circumstances that the society will deal with, or any comments about that?
Yeah, well, it already has. And I was in Zimbabwe several years ago, and each of the hospitals now, when a woman comes in to deliver a baby, they put the woman on a certain medication that reduces the transmission to the baby dramatically. The problem is it's a single agent. And so now the women that are doing that, because they don't have enough money to buy all the 3-drug combination, have their viruses now mutated, so it's resistant to that drug. So you're seeing that happening, and that's becoming a major problem. And the laboratory's not available. I mean, you know, we're talking about laboratories that are $1,000 for a set of tests. You know, they have to do on these people, my patients, every 3 or 4 months. You know, the amount of money these people have to survive is $1 a day sometimes, or less. You know, they can't afford these blood tests. The countries can't afford the blood tests. So how do you measure resistance unless you're doing some sort of research in those areas? How do you make sure they're adherent? How do you know what the viral loads are? I mean, it's very, very frightening.
Now, Harold, one of the things you do, I think, and we discussed this, is that just awareness with young people about just the dangers of a host of things that are out there. And I think in Houston County, you've talked to high school students, or can you discuss that?
About 1989, the Houston County school system invited me to speak to all the 8th graders. In fact, they shipped them up to the college in Macon.
Yes.
And after that, they set it up down here in the Ag Center. And ever since then, I've been speaking to, roughly 1,800 to 2,000 8th graders per year. And it's a very graphic talk. It's a reality-based education talk. I show them the truth about HIV, how serious this can be, because I really believe how can these children make an informed decision about their behavior? They don't know the consequences. So I'm showing them the consequences. The wonderful thing about this county is that it builds on that. And so there's a curriculum that builds on this, continues to educate their population. So if you look at our HIV rates, they're about a fifth or fourth of what you see in Bibb County.
Now, just a quick comment about that. I believe the administration in Bibb County is not as progressive. Is that fair?
Well, I don't.
Let's not be too tough. But
I don't know.
You don't have as much of a chance to talk.
Yeah. And again, I think you have to be realistic about sexual behaviors in high school kids. I mean, in even middle school children. I mean, it's going on. Obviously, we have some of the highest teenage pregnancy rates in the country.
And it's higher in Bibb County, is it not?
Yes, it is. I think it's
than
twice,
Houston County.
Yeah, it's you got twice the number of teenage pregnancies in Bibb as you do in Houston County. You got a third of the number of sexually transmitted diseases in Houston as you do in Bibb County. So, I mean, we're looking at quite a few measures, and again, the population is about the same, where it looks like Houston County has really done a marvelous job as far as preventing transmission of HIV and other STDs.
Well, I mean, I think that's commendable, and I think it's an important issue for society in general to be aware of these diseases that afflict young people. And Harold, I mean, kudos to you for your noble work in trying to help people with these awful afflictions. And so thank you, and it's been nice talking with you, and we'll look forward to more interchanges in the future. Thank you so much.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.